Welcome to Literacy RX, brought to you by SpeechMED. Hosted by Dr. David Lee Scher, this Literacy RX podcast will facilitate insightful discussions with influential health executives on the newest trends in digital health, the crucial issue of health equity, and the powerful impact of language and literacy on patient outcomes. Subscribe and join us as we delve into exploring how to create healthier and more inclusive communities.
Hi, everyone. This is Dr. David Scher. I'm the Chief Medical Officer of SpeechMED. I'm very pleased and honored to host another podcast for Literacy RX. And our guest today is Dr. Katie Cornish, who has a doctorate in pharmacology from the University of Minnesota and has been involved in clinical trials as well as patient advocacy. And she's really melded the two, which is a fascinating thing for us at SpeechMED, and we're going to hear more about that. She's currently the Director of Clinical Trials and and Partner Engagement for the Tigerlily Foundation. She's worked in areas of clinical trials, but really has evolved in concentrating her scientific background with patient advocacy and diversity, which is of great interest to us at SpeechMED. She's been involved in designing clinical trials, and we're going to hear more about that. Welcome, Dr. Cornish, and we're glad to have you. How did you get interested as a scientist in health equity and diversity in clinical trials?
Actually, kind of in two forms. So first, when I was in grad school, my dissertation work was on a vaccine that was going through clinical trials at the time. And unfortunately, it did not meet its primary endpoints. But I think it was because of the way the trial was designed. It's very cool. It has its own Wikipedia page, actually. It was a vaccine against nicotine to help relapse prevention in former smokers that had recently quit. But of course, it turns out, right, that relapse prevention is not a particularly sexy marketing term. Everyone wants the cessation therapy in the first place. And so even though the vaccine was designed to prevent relapse, the trials were designed with a primary endpoint of cessation, right? So quit rates. And it didn't meet the endpoints. And we said, well, hey, what happened here? There was some translation in the process that just didn't get made between the bench side team and pharma. And that felt like something I really wanted to dive into, is sort of that communications piece where you're really bridging the gap between two groups that maybe have different intentions. But there's got to be a way to make it all work in the middle. And so I focused my career on kind of that aspect, and throughout kind of the couple of different positions that I've held, I had the chance to work in patient recruitment. And I felt like we could always be doing more than we were. Everything was sort of one size fits all. Here's one approach that we're going to take. Here's one set of recruitment materials. Here's one way we're going to talk about the study with patients. And I felt like we could just do so much more. And I had the opportunity to work with Lori Abrams during that job. And she really helped me kind of get a good understanding and get a good footing started on, what's the breadth of what we really can do to help support patients, on a one-by-one basis. And it's not rocket science. And I really want to get that message out to people. It's not hard to meet the patients where they are.
I think that's fascinating. As a former clinical investigator who has done stuff with the NIH and pharma companies, I really had the firsthand experience of dealing with recruitment and follow-up, and its evolution into identifying the fact that even patients' genetics, let alone ethnicities, can affect, clinical trials. So that all turns into the same sort of soup of diversity. Tell us about your Tigerlily Foundation and what it does and how that attracted you to this kind of thing.
So Tigerlily Foundation is a nationwide breast cancer advocacy and awareness organization. So we focus a lot on education, advocacy, and empowerment, and specifically for women of BIPOC backgrounds, who are generally, kind of bear a burden of the breast cancer disease, especially with triple negative breast cancer, but really haven't been particularly well represented in the clinical trials that are out there to develop new treatments. So we have a massive community of advocates, of patient advocates, and much of what we do is really amplifying their voices and helping them get into the positions where they can change the way that trials are designed. We do a lot of policy work also. So, it's not just kind of from the sponsor pharma side, but it's also from, the legislative side as well. So we're kind of tackling it from multiple directions.
I love that. That's full spectrum advocacy.
Mm-hmm.
What issues do you see existing with regards to clinical trials and health literacy, language, levels of communication, things of that nature? I'm sure in your travels with regards to pharma and clinical trials, you've seen this, and that is really our mission at SpeechMED, and that's why we're having these podcasts to really put a focus and a spotlight on health literacy, which I think is underappreciated as an important topic.
Absolutely. I think the easier question is, where don't you see the issues that still exist? The recruitment materials, the consent forms, I feel like we're still throwing a 30-page document over the fence at people with a 5-minute summary and saying, hey, sign this, it'll be fine. Right? You can't do that to people. And at this point, it's, not even to start on the literacy level of these materials. I have a PhD and I can't even decipher some of the trial designs that they write out in the flyers and brochures for the recruitment materials. All of that language needs to be run through a grade level assessment. The average reading level is what, 5th or 6th grade?
Right.
And I would put every penny in my pocket that if you take the first trial recruitment ad that you see and you put the language through an assessment, it's going to come back at college level, best case, maybe 11th grade, right? And there are so many journal articles that capture exactly this, right? So this is not unknown. It's not a secret. And the industry really just needs to put in the effort and take the extra few steps to meet the patients where they are. The harder they make it to join their study, the more the outcomes look like they already do, which is frankly just a lot of middle-aged white people making up the majority of trial participants across every indication. I have a friend who is an anesthesiologist in Boston, and he and I went to grad school together. He talks a lot about being with patients when they wake up from anesthesia. And he is of Middle Eastern descent. And he talks about, how scary people feel when they're waking up from anesthesia, they're really groggy, and they just see this guy standing over them going, "Hey, are you awake?" They might not, English might not be their first language. I know one of the hospitals he's worked at has a really large immigrant population. And so he went and got laminated sheets with like just a couple of quick phrases for people in 12 different languages. He got those all made for his department so that people, when they're waking up, they have something to kind of point at in case, things
That's
are kind of
awesome.
moving a little bit slowly.
That's great.
So it's just the small things
Mhm.
that we can do, not just as sponsors, but as sites too, to, again, meet the patient where they're at.
I think that's a great example. And people, when I say people, I mean people in the healthcare industry all across the spectrum, all stakeholders, do not appreciate the fact that health literacy really dictates whether somebody is going to follow a recommended protocol, whether they're going to have life-changing, surgery, whether they're going to follow their medication instructions, how they're going to treat their children as caregivers, and it goes way beyond translating or having one sentence, that they can understand. And again, that's the mission of SpeechMED. Just to elaborate a little further, where in the clinical trial process do you feel, I know it's important all across, but do you feel the need for improving health literacy is the most?
I mean, yeah, I can't not say all of it, right? But I think at the very first stages of it, if you can't get people in the door in the first place, then look, your retention methods are going to be irrelevant if you can't recruit anybody.
Have you in the recruiting process found that part of the difficulty in recruiting patients for clinical trials is the fact that due to health illiteracy, they may not even understand their diagnosis?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And just another example for this, and one I love to share. I saw Rosalind Daniels talk about this with regards to prostate cancer, which I think, we all know that Black and African American men bear a disproportionate burden of. And she talks about, going into communities to bring them onto clinical trials. And you can't just walk out there and say, "Hey, I've got a trial for you." You have to back up so much further. You've got to start with the education piece. People don't even know what a prostate is, nonetheless know if it's healthy or not, and then what the conditions are, and then how you treat that, and then that clinical trials are an option for that. So, recruitment, such a huge piece, but the initial education and the investment into the community, that really has to be that first priority. And you've got to be speaking to them in a way that's relatable, a way that they see themselves represented. It's really about going out and targeting your information for the people that you want to bring onto the trial, rather than, getting a one-size-fits-all talking script.
How do you see the best way that pharma and medical device companies and others who are doing clinical trials, nonprofits, how do you see the best way of them improving their reach out via health literacy? In other words, what things do you see are being done, or how do you think things can be improved in improving the clinical trial process?
I think probably first and foremost is to partner with either advocacy organizations or community groups that have a strong presence in the communities that they're reaching out to. Nobody knows those folks better than those folks themselves, right? And this is somewhere where I think sponsors can really use their sites too, because the site staff are part of those communities, and they're going to know who those communities respect and trust and listen to, right? Whether it's churches or tribal groups or whatever's relevant for that particular, population. Sponsors need to do the legwork to figure that out, and then sort of, engage in work with the community that's not transactional, right? It's got to be long term. They really have to get in there and start learning what's relevant for that population before they can start asking that population to, hey, do this favor for me. You benefit too, but come on in.
Right. That's very insightful. Do you, so all these companies now have officers of diversity and equity. Mm-hmm. Are those, and I won't put you on the spot because you may not have all the answers, but are those people mostly internally looking, or are those people involved in clinical trials and discussing that with the CROs, the clinical research organizations?
It's both, and it really depends on each specific sponsor. I have worked with sort of the both ends of the spectrum, where we're talking about engaging with partnerships with advocacy organizations, and on the one hand they're like, yep, here's a list of 400 of them, and here's exactly what we're doing with each one. And on the other side they're like, really, that's a great thought. Haven't pictured that one. Okay, how does that work? So it's end to end, and it's not necessarily a big pharma versus small pharma situation either. We have kind of seen both on both sizes of sponsors, and I think with the FDA guidance that was issued in April of 22, which I think is still in draft form but should be in the process of finalization, as well as the legislature that was passed as part of the omnibus bill last December. Both of those are, essentially requiring diversity action plans for clinical trials. And I think those are what's driving the effort at this point. It's clearly we didn't get far enough making it, you have to do this for the good of the people. Right. So now we're making it a law, and folks are really starting to kind of get into it and say, okay, how do we do this? What are our specific approaches? How do we target this to a site basis? What are each of one of our sites going to be doing? So it's a slow machine to get started, but I think it's heading in the right direction.
Do you foresee organizations like PhRMA and AdvaMed producing standards for this kind of augmentation of clinical trials? In other words, do you see the industry as a whole trying to standardize things, or do you think it's going to be herding cats where, some companies are doing a much better job than others after all this is enforceable?
I still think that some companies are going to do a better job than others, just because kind of the nature of the beast, right? Some companies are going to meet the minimum requirements, and some are going to go above and beyond, and really try to establish their name as a trusted source in the community. And that's what has to happen. for this whole process to be successful, I think, long term.
So as a foundation, which door of pharma does Tigerlily, discuss things where they go through? In other words, what are your first contacts or people that are of interest in clinical trials in pharma?
Often it will be a diversity and development entity or a DEI officer of some sort.
Oh, okay.
But also the study teams. So we have definitely been in contact with just individual study teams who are saying, hey, look, we know that the population with this disease doesn't match who we've had in the trials. Help us figure out how to do it better. And
Right.
so it can be on that sort of broad top of the triangle where they're going to, disseminate it across all of their indications or their portfolios, or it can be like just the study team reaching out directly, at the bottom of the triangle going, hey, you know what? We're going to make this work, and then we're going to bring it up.
That's like a backbone. I love that.
It is.
Do you see a time where advocacy will be just woven into the system and you won't need to have, separate foundations and things like that? I mean, obviously that's the holy grail.
Right.
But things have really come a lot far in the last 10 years. I know, even just realizing that a lot of seminal trials are biased based on people looking back and studying the study population. So I share your enthusiasm and vision for that kind of thing. What do you see as the biggest obstacles, even going forward in your work with the foundation? So just what are things that you're striving to do in the next year or two that you haven't done before, or that hasn't been experienced before?
Oh gosh, that's a big question. So I can say that so Tigerlily historically has been a breast cancer centered foundation. Our CEO was diagnosed with breast cancer 16 or 17 years ago. So, and she, has really championed becoming the voice of the patient for this population. But we are starting to branch out into other women's cancers. So I'm really excited to see that expansion, that sort of breadth of reach, because I think at this point we're a very trusted name in the community for breast cancer. And I would love to see us become that trusted resource for patients more broadly,
Has Tigerlily been involved specifically with health literacy, going to pharma and saying, this study is great, but you have to change, things the way they're worded or what populations they're targeting?
Yeah, absolutely. We do fairly often. We have our patient advocates review a study protocol or a consent form or the recruitment materials and share their input on it and say, hey, these are the things that don't make sense, right? Me as a regular person that could potentially be in your study. These are the things that would prevent me from joining your trial, right? These are the things that I would need help with if you were going to recruit me. So, we have a pretty strong ability to influence trial design in that kind of format. And I would love to see us grow that again as well.
Once you're involved in a clinical or involved with a pharma company with a clinical trial, do you follow that through as a foundation, or are you actually part of that trial in some manner, or are you on the sidelines at that point?
I think it depends on the specific project, kind of depends on the sponsor and the study, and the timeline for the study. Because I know, some of these are 5 or 7 years long. So it's hard to stay attached when, all of your efforts are kind of at that very beginning stage. Because if you're talking about how a protocol should be written, or, your recruitment materials should be written, you should really be doing that at startup or even right before. So I think, where possible, we continue to stay engaged with the study. Like maybe we will do some partnership on a media campaign, to support recruitment for their study, or, if they're having large scale recruitment events, we can have our advocates support that on the ground. But it just depends on the study at hand.
I was a chair of an IRB, which for people don't know, it's an institutional review board which reviews clinical studies for hospitals and organizations to make sure that the patients are essentially protected, but they should serve as patient advocacy organizations as well by making sure that things are health literate, et cetera, and that we used to review consent forms and protocols for that kind of thing. And I would still hope that goes through even after the legislation is completed. Do you have any final thoughts on health literacy and clinical trials?
I had a thought on what you were just saying for a minute there, and it's totally gone. I really want for us, and this is something I've just been thinking of the last couple of weeks, but it feels very timely that you're talking about being on an IRB. I really want for us to get our patient advocates in as external committee members for IRBs, because I think that kind of thing is going to go so far, right?
Absolutely.
To really actually have the voice of the community on an IRB. And we've got folks of all kinds of backgrounds who I think would be absolutely stellar for it. As far as my final thoughts, I think it's so hard to pinpoint, one area where, this, is what needs the most help. This is going to be the one, thing that really fixes the gap in health literacy, or, the reading gap in the materials that are presented. But I think it's just, at the very starting end, right? Do people relate to the materials you're providing, right? Do they relate to the ad that they heard on the radio, or that they saw on Facebook or Google, or the brochure they saw at their community center, right? Do they see themselves in that? Is the information easily digestible? Can you get it, across in just a couple of bullet points? Can they sit and think about it? It just has to be relatable, right? In pharma and in medicine as a whole, there's such a huge movement toward individualized medicine, right? You take this panel and you get this score on all your biomarkers, and it says, okay, beep, boop, boop, you need this drug, instead of kind of the one size fits all. Why aren't we doing this with the way we talk to people too, right? Just like treatments, the way you engage with patients isn't one size fits all. You really have to make the effort to reach out to people where they're at. And that's valid, not just for that initial outreach, the education or the recruitment, but then the retention, the follow-up. Are you checking in? How are you checking in? Is it a way, in a way that's relevant for that patient, that population, that community?
I did consultancy a long time ago, probably 12 years ago, for some companies that were in communications in pharma. And the topic at that time was, how do we incorporate social media in both recruiting patients and not following patients individually, but really getting a handle of what patients are thinking, even and discussing. And then there was, a lot of pushback by pharma, some rightfully justified based on regulations and things of that nature. But has anything evolved, from your perspective as far as social media and clinical trials?
I think we're doing a little bit better of a job, and I think kind of through advisory boards, that are very patient-led, a little bit better of a job targeting populations through social media. So, using keywords specific for whatever population, or the zip code based geo-targeting and things like that. I think, kind of it's like a little bit awkward because as technology advances, there's sort of that
there's a lag,
the needle, right?
Yeah.
You're like, ooh, I don't want things to get too specific. I don't want it's following me around all the time.
Right.
But the benefit of that is that, we can really start to kind of put these announcements and this education and these advertisements where people are looking, right? And hopefully through that, make it relevant to them.
I think that's great. One last question. So now clinical research organizations, for people who don't know, are the companies that actually are subcontracted by pharma companies and medical device companies to actually conduct the clinical trial. Do you see CROs as being most important in this, effort towards health literacy and patient diversity, dealing with, or is it the pharma company itself?
I don't think it can be one or the other. It really has to be hand in hand, because the CRO is executing the strategy that's being provided by the pharma company. And both of those need to be completely aligned in order to be effective, really. You can have fantastic ideas and approaches to engage with communities and provide them educational opportunities, but if they're not actually getting to the people in the community, what good is it, right? On the other hand, if you've got folks engaged in the community, your MSLs and other staff on the CRO side are, being engaged at the site level, and the site level, the site team is getting out there. If the information that they're being provided to hand out and to share isn't relatable, then again, it's still not going to work. So it has to be, all parties have to be fully engaged in this. No one can be sleeping on the job here.
No, I totally agree. I want to say in closing that this conversation has been very, very informative to me, but also excellent because it's a side of healthcare that I don't think many people are really involved with or know what goes on behind the scenes. So I think you were the perfect person to discuss clinical trials and health diversity with. So I want to thank you very much on behalf of the SpeechMED team, and I want to wish you all the best in your professional and personal endeavors.
Thank you so much. I am honored to have been invited onto the podcast.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thanks.